Jimmy Carter's obviously a decent human being. Nobody should gainsay that fact. But he also remains, in my own opinion, a politician. It's in his bones. And he had to have known when he published the book that there was going to be an audience for it, because he realizes he's close to religious groups and grassroots organizations. He understands that the sentiment in the United States, slowly but surely, is shifting. And the sentiment is most pronouncedly shifting in the American Jewish community. Again, the poll data would take me some time to go through. The main pollster of American Jewry is a fellow named Stephen Cohen. And Stephen Cohen wrote, I guess it was a couple of years ago, I'll just quote him, "The attachment of American Jews to Israel has weakened measurably, continuing a long-term trend. Respondents were less likely than in comparable earlier surveys to say they care about Israel, talk about Israel with others, or engage in pro-Israel activities. About 30% of American Jewry respond fairly consistently in recent years, about 1/3, that they feel distant from Israel. And the most significant, I think, poll finding is for the younger generation. It gives you a sense of where things are headed. Among Jews under 35, about half registered a low attachment, that's the phrase, a low attachment to Israel. And remarkably, when this generation under 40 were asked, if Israel were destroyed, would you conceive it as a personal tragedy? And the less than half, when asked that question, responded yes. It was for me a sobering moment, because frankly, where I asked the question, my answer would of course be, I would find it a personal tragedy. The destruction of any country or any people should be felt as a personal tragedy by anyone with humane impulses. But the distancing, as it's called, has now become so significant that, as I said, less than half, when asked the question, said Israel's destruction would be a personal tragedy. The obvious question is, well, what's going on? How do you account for this shift in opinion, and in fact, not just in American opinion in general, but this shift in opinion among American Jewry? And as I said earlier, in my opinion, there are many, I should point out, there are many theories trying to explain this phenomenon. The phenomenon is acknowledged in the scholarly literature. It's called the distancing phenomenon, that American Jews are distancing themselves from Israel. But there's different interpretations of how to account for it. Many people claim that the main reason is intermarriage. Jews are now intermarrying at a rate of probably around 60%, maybe a bit higher or a little lower, depending on who you look at. And that the intermarriage is the main root, the taproot of this decline in American Jewish interest in Israel. That happens not to be my opinion. As I said earlier, my own view is that much more is now known about Israel's past, its present, and the prospects for the future. And what is now known is simply irreconcilable with being a liberal. And most American Jews, as I've said, overwhelmingly are liberal in their persuasion. And let me just give you, in the time that's allotted me, let me just give you a few examples. There are older people in the room, and they'll surely remember that probably for the first 20 or 30 years of Israel's existence, this question always used to crop up: how did the Palestinians become refugees in 1948? And the standard claim of Israel, officially of Israel and its supporters, and in fact most scholars, the standard claim was that the Arab armies stood poised to invade the newly born state of Israel, and they sent out these radio broadcasts telling the Palestinians to flee and telling them that once we have driven the Jews into the sea, then you'll have the opportunity to return to your homes. And that was the standard Arab radio broadcast interpretation. How many of you remember that? Or actually I can't believe it's just 2 or 3. That was fairly widespread. Even when I was growing up, that's what pretty much you read in the history books. By the late 1980s, 1990s, and to the present, the record has now been radically revised based on genuine scholarship and archival research. And there's a broad consensus among Israeli historians, doesn't include all of them, it's a broad consensus, that what happened in 1948, to quote Israel's leading historian, who's also now on the far right end of the spectrum, Benny Morris, he's the leading historian on what happened to the refugees. He said what happened in 1948 was an ethnic cleansing. The Israeli armies expelled the indigenous population of Palestine. And in fact, Benny Morris says, if you read his history books, he says that the ethnic cleansing was inbuilt and inevitable in Zionism. Those are his words. For the obvious reason, you want to create an overwhelmingly Jewish state in an area which is overwhelmingly non-Jewish, and the only way you can do it is by expelling the indigenous population. Not unlike the United States, where we wanted to create an overwhelmingly white republic in an area which was already inhabited with a non-white indigenous population, and the only way to do it, well, most of you know that history by now. And the same challenge occurred to the Zionists with the same result in 1948. That's the historical record. The human rights record, as I said, the claim used to be that Israel had pretty much what you would call a liberal occupation. That's what was said in the 1970s and through to, you could say, the mid-1980s. And in fact, human rights organizations like Amnesty International were very, very careful about criticizing Israel's human rights record for both good reasons and bad. The good reason was they didn't want to criticize Israel's human rights record out of deference to the Nazi extermination during World War II, and so Israel got, you might call, some moral extenuation on account of what happened during the Nazi Holocaust. That was the good reason, and the bad reason was, to repeat it again, you'll excuse me, Jews are overwhelmingly liberal. They were also very well off, and they were contributing to the main human rights organizations. They were also very pro-Israel. And there was the fear that if these human rights organizations, if they started to criticize Israel, the money was going to be pulled from places like Amnesty International. Well, things began to change beginning in the late 1980s because Israeli human rights organizations began to spring up, and they began to document very ugly realities of that occupation. So to take one example, up until 1990, Amnesty International would never refuse to accuse Israel of practicing torture in the occupied territories. If you read Amnesty publications now, they acknowledge that Israel was torturing Palestinian detainees from right after the occupation in 1967. In fact, even if you open up Tom Segev's new book on the June 1967 war, the book that just came out, he says very forthrightly, from right after the occupation in 1967, Israel was torturing Palestinian detainees.